If I had to choose one word to describe World War I, it would be cataclysmic.
A single word to describe World War I would be catastrophic.
Transformational, because nothing was the same once the war was over.
I think the one word that helps to describe World War I is destructive.
I would choose the word mistake.
Stupid. That's how I would encapsulate the First World War. World War I did not have to happen. There was no inherent reason. It literally was dumb.
A person during World War I thought they were in a new age, a fascinating modern world, the world that produced the Titanic, aviation, and incredible advances in medicine. It seemed like everything was within grasp right before World War I, and all of these would be smashed on the battlefields of Europe.
From the very beginning of the road to war, to everything that comes out of the war and the peace plans is not just one mistake, but a series of mistakes. People had the option to choose peace, and time and again seemed to make the wrong decisions.
It was lack of communication. It was intellectual rigidity. It was a simple falling of dominoes that never needed to fall. And so the children of the Renaissance and the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment ended up massacring themselves in the mud and blood of the trenches.
Not just destructive in terms of what happens to men's bodies on the battlefield, destructive in terms of global politics.
The Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the grievous weakening of the British and French empires. The world that existed in 1918 was remarkably different from the one that existed in 1914.
The whole globe was influenced by this war, and the transformational changes cover a wide range from technology and weapons. You see the first tanks, you see the maturation of artillery guns, machine guns, trench warfare. World War I begins the modern era. I think one really clear way of understanding the shift in World War I in terms of technology is that soldiers rode in on horses and they left in airplanes.
At the beginning of World War I, warfare is almost in the 19th century style. The French sincerely believed that going at the troops with determination at enemy troops is the way to go. What they don't understand is the collision of technologies.
General Pershing didn't believe in the trench warfare. He grew up on the plains fighting in Indian warfare where it was an open confrontation. So he trained his troops to fight in the open warfare. The British and French generals thought he was crazy. They criticized him for this.
It's impossible to cross that deadly beaten zone, the deadly zone between the two lines. The most determined line of soldiers cannot oppose a machine gun that fires hundreds of rounds a minute.
World War I wasn't just the first industrial war, it was also the first scientific war. It was the first time that societies had taken all of their resources of science and intelligence and said, how do we do this better? How do we fight better? How do we develop technologies?
A lot of the armaments you see in World War I had been used before: submarines, trench warfare, Gatling guns, machine guns. What happens during World War I is that these become mature and these become even more destructive.
During the war, the governments of all the different warring powers put enormous amounts of time and effort into scientific and technical development, so that the advancements which would have happened anyway happen at a much more rapid pace, and they happen according to the priorities of the warring powers.
Something happened in trench warfare that changed the course of the war and changed the way we understand warfare today, and that is chemical warfare.
The first gas attack, it was at a place called Vimy Ridge, and it was mostly Canadian soldiers who were being attacked. And The Canadian soldiers who were in the trenches saw this cloud of haze coming towards them. They had no gas masks. They had no equipment to protect them. Chlorine gas causes your lungs to fill with liquid, and so essentially you drown from the inside out. It was really the first war in which all of the technologies and science and industry of the 19th century were put to the sole purpose of killing people.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Incoming!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony, being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day, the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home. So America watches World War I from 1914 to April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had, from the very beginning, an official policy of neutrality, but neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet, within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the US, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the materiel, and the resources that these allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.
World War I leads to World War II as day follows night. By the end of World War I, everybody is looking to get advantage.
World War I didn't really end in 1918. It brutalized an entire generation of Europeans. It brutalized an entire generation of people around the world. And it made them realize that war on this scale was not only possible, but actually thinkable.
There's a wonderful, wonderful political cartoon where the fat politicians and generals are walking out of Versailles, and there's a little tiny boy, and he's crying in the corner. And I'm not kidding, he says, "I'm cannon fodder for 1940. They knew, anyone with half a brain knew that the Treaty of Versailles was essentially the starting gun for the Second World War.
Essentially what happened is that you create such an unstable economy and so much animosity between nations that you're just seeding the field of war to rise and grow again.
A lot of the anger, animosity, resentment that fuels the rise of the National Socialists of Adolf Hitler in Germany can be directly tied to that. It would be difficult to argue that that's simply propaganda that's utilized by Adolf Hitler. These were very difficult terms for the German people to handle. And it creates this bunker mentality, this us against the world mentality that ultimately will play out in Hitler being able to create a program that appeals to that sentiment.
To the average German, they have been sold out by the politicians.
In particular, it made people like Adolf Hitler, who had fought, after all, in the German army in World War I, think that if only the Germans could do it again, but do it right this time, they could actually win.
We call it World War I, World War II, but it's really two different stages of one global conflict. Just happens that people put their arms down for a 20-year period, and then they went back to fighting again.
Summarizing the legacy of World War I in a word is difficult, but the word I use would be paradox. Because here was a tremendous opportunity for the world to learn about some of the dangerous mistakes that helped to lead to that war. And yet what we saw over the course of the 20th century in many ways was the replication of those same errors again and again and again.
What World War I gave us was this legacy of inquiry of how to make war more effective, better, but ultimately, and with horrible consequences, much bloodier.
It changed the world forever because of the Second World War and the fact that Germany was left unchecked. Germany was able to build up its armaments even though it was told, as a country, you need to cut back on your navy, you need to cut back on your army, your aircraft, and so forth. And so really the legacy is that it led to a second and more costlier war.
I think the legacy of the First World War for America is not only about our place in the world, but also about how America itself is transformed, and in particular, the relationship between Americans and the federal government. Coming out of the First World War, the federal government is much larger, more powerful, and everyday Americans who had experienced the draft, who had experienced food conservation, who had experienced the mobilization of their labor during the war, understood that Uncle Sam had significant powers.
The world had a tremendous opportunity in 1918 to ferret out those things that were dividing people. Our failure to deal with those issues, to have self-determination or allow people to talk about that, certainly will be a contributing factor in Vietnam, certainly will be a contributing factor as we talk about the world today and we look at the Middle East. A lot of those problems, a lot of those issues politically that we failed to address in substantive ways in World War I continue to haunt us to this day.
World War I looked very different from different perspectives, but they all knew it was horrific.
This is a war between nations, and the national governments have to make an argument to their people about why they should sacrifice their lives, their time, their money for the war effort.
The thing you have to understand about Germany and France is they were in the middle of it. They were trapped. They had no option to leave the war early. They had no option to do anything else. They had to fight. The British and the Russians, on the other hand, were a little bit more distant. The Russians on one end, the British on the other end.
Britain is looking at it first as, oh, our allies are in danger, we're going to help them. I don't think they ever saw themselves immediately threatened until they realized that the Germans were developing new types of aerial combat. That had never been seen before. This changes the way they look at the world. It makes them push tremendously hard into developing new technology for fighting wars.
In France, World War I is a necessary evil at the beginning of the war. They're chafing at the bit from the loss of Alsace-Lorraine during the Franco-Prussian War. And they want to get the lost territories back. So it's to redeem France. In Russia, it's the love of the Tsar and pan-Slavism. They have to help their Slavic brothers oppressed by the Austro-Hungarians. So everybody has a different reason for wanting to go to war in the summer of 1914. All of them seem compelling.
The United States, by contrast, was completely distant. We were separated by 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean.
President Woodrow Wilson, who was in office when the war started, took an isolationist view. He felt that America did not need to be involved in this war. It wasn't our war. We didn't have a military presence overseas.
Germans feel like they are painted into a box. They've been hemmed in by foreign policy by the British. They're forced to make militaristic decisions because France and Russia, and to some extent England, are aligned against them.
What you see in Germany is toward the end of the war, soldiers were starving, their infrastructure was wearing out, They were putting everything into the fronts, and they were leaving their population in Germany destitute.
Very quickly, people understood that they were fighting a world war. The First World War was, for Europe, a war of empires, a war about empires. So violence and war had always been part of that project, but that was largely carried out outside of Europe. And then, as Europe itself collapses into war, much of the violence of imperial rivalry actually plays out on the European continent and brings that crisis back home to Europe.
One thing that you should know about World War I, it brought us into the modern era.
And today, we live in the world that World War I shaped.
For Americans in particular, it brought Americans firmly into the 20th century and into a global mindset.
You can see that in technology, the development of planes. You can see that in social movements, women's equal rights, the civil rights movement.
Suddenly, one worker in an industrialized nation could produce what hundreds of workers were needed to produce in the 18th century and the early 19th century. This gave an advantage to nations in building ships, in exploiting technology, in changing the way that things were done, both intellectually and physically.
It's the 20th century. It's a whole new ballgame from the 19th century.
The one thing that people should know about World War I, probably the toll that it takes in terms of what happens with death counts after the war that are really complicated by the influenza, the spread of germs. And a lot of times we don't think about the impact of the war after the war.
It's uncertain of where the first case of the flu took place, although recent studies seem to indicate that an Army training camp in Kansas is where. And then all of a sudden it spread like wildfire across the United States and impacted major cities. Everyone knew someone who was impacted by the flu. Problem was, there weren't enough doctors to handle this.
So how do you care for those that have died, but also those that are incapacitated? And what is the trajectory of disease in the aftermath of war? And those are things that typically we don't associate with World War I, but are really actually very important.
The one thing that people should know about World War I was how unbelievably violent it was. World War I was by far the bloodiest war that Europe had experienced in centuries.
The Battle of the Somme, probably the most famous battle that the British troops were involved in, July 1st, 1916. It's 19,000 soldiers were killed in a single day. It's astronomical to think about that figure. These were young men who, of course, didn't come home. They didn't get married. They didn't have children. And a whole generation of British life was lost on a single battle.
What made the First World War a modern war was the way that it mobilized whole societies. And not just mobilized them as laborers and farmers, but also made whole societies targets. This is the first time that you see sort of mass targeting of civilian populations as well as soldiers. And I think that's what makes the First World War distinctive and distinctively modern.
The rise of nationalism is key to understanding how World War I comes about.
The people of all of the countries fighting rose up to defend the countries that they loved. And because of that, they were willing to accept slaughter on a scale unparalleled.
This is a war between nations, and the national governments have to make an argument to their people about why they should sacrifice their lives, their time, their money for the war effort.
It also is a culmination of their own fears about colonialization, about this process where you have diverse people being brought into empires that really don't share their same cultural ideas, their same cultural identity. It's the problem of nationalism. And it's the problem of nationalism expressed violently in this terrible war that cost Europe almost a generation of people.
Perfect illustration, Eastern Europe. Look at Serbia. Serbians are saying, we don't want to be ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's an old, tired, imperialistic structure. We are our own country. It's the Serbians who assassinate Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, and of course, that's the trigger that begins the whole conflict.
The outbreak of the war intensifies national feelings. It also makes nationalism the language both of war and of the post-war settlement.
And more than that, it made the people who had fought the war feel like they had earned something.
So if you go to Versailles, if you go to the treaty negotiations, you can see them discussing the rights of small nations, the rights of national self-determination. Those are words that Wilson uses. And he wanted nations to be independent, discrete things.
He saw a world that would never again go to war. A world where squabbles between nations could be settled diplomatically, where they could not have to be settled militarily. This was to him the war to end all wars. And I sincerely believe that Wilson realized before he passed away that World War I had been for nothing.
The Harlem Hellfighters was a regiment of New York National Guardsmen in the First World War. They were set up to fail by their own government. They were humiliated, degraded, eventually given to the French army as a throwaway, and they ended up coming home as one of the most decorated units in the entire U.S. Army.
The Harlem Hellfighters are one of the most important regiments in American history. In World War I, they helped to establish to the entire world the power of black soldiers in the military.
It was very difficult at that time for African Americans to get into the United States military because there was this perception that African Americans would not do well in battle. They had to overcome the prejudice of their own countrymen and yet also perform ably on the battlefield.
Like so many units of African American descent, when they go overseas, they're not sure what they're going to do. Are they going to fight as infantry? Or are they going to be stevedores and load ships? Or are they going to be labor units and cut wood?
And so they're committed to labor duty, they're unloading ships, building latrines, those type of support services. And as you can imagine, these men have been trained and they're willing to fight, they're ready to fight, and this is stressful for them.
They were finally given to the French army, which in a way was an even greater insult because in the First World War, when the United States entered, General Pershing, the commanding officer, was very clear that American forces would not be fed piecemeal into the French and British army because the French and British wanted reinforcements, and Pershing said absolutely not. When Americans join this war, they will fight as an American force under an American flag led by an American general. ... except for the black guys. You can have them.
Henry Johnson is perhaps one of the most remarkable black military heroes in U.S. history.
And he found himself in no man's land with Private Needham Roberts manning a listening post.
And Needham Roberts hears click, click, click. And he realizes somebody's cutting the wire. It's potentially a German raid.
And so Roberts is passing him grenades, and they line up these grenades, and the Germans actually do come across the lines. Roberts is hurt, and now Henry Johnson is left to defend their position and to stave off this attack. And then he makes the mistake of jamming a French cartridge into his American gun, and it no longer will work. And the Germans are on top of it.
He then used his rifle like a club, and then he ended up fighting with a knife against the Kaiser's best and turned them.
He's wounded in the fray. He's struck, for example, in the foot, and has a debilitating injury as a result. And he fights them off, he says, for what seemed like an hour.
The Germans ran shrieking into the night, all because of one man.
It's not until the next morning that people realize what a tremendous act this was. They discover 4 bodies of dead German soldiers. And they also realize from the equipment and other things that are left behind that as many as 30 may have been involved in this altercation.
As soon as he drove off those Germans, the French awarded him with the Croix de Guerre, a great honor. Unfortunately, it took about 75 years for the US government to give him the Legion of Merit. Had he been white, he would have walked out of that war with the Medal of Honor. What was so shocking to me when I began to research the story of the Hellfighters was that after they had performed so magnificently in combat, the United States government actually sent a memorandum to the French government, essentially implementing Jim Crow, essentially saying, don't give them some notion that they are equals, because we don't want them taking that notion back to the United States and demanding equality.
When they come back to the United States, he's not awarded the Purple Heart. There's no notation in his military record of his injury. And so he winds up not being able to work because of this injury. He doesn't get any kind of assistance from the Army or from the government as a result. And he ends up dying in 1929 penniless. So it again shows the paradox. Here's this great story of valor and of courage on the part of this soldier, and ultimately he comes back to a nation that doesn't honor that sacrifice.
We tend to think we all know American history so well, but the story of the Harlem Hellfighters should be one of the first stories told. It wasn't about killing other people, it was about being Americans and serving their country well. That was the inclination of the Harlem Hellfighters.
When you are African American in 1917, democracy is armor. Democracy is a weapon. And to fight for a war to make the world safe for democracy was something more than just some ethereal crusade for the Hellfighters. It had concrete results. They were fighting for the rights to be a citizen of the country that they were born in.